how I can do it. Okay.
Recording has started.
So, hello everyone. It's good to see the faces I know, and I'm so happy to see so many people here. And the intention of our webinar with Kathleen today is to make space for you to meet Kathleen, and some of you have already done it. So we want to create the space for Kathleen to share what's her passion in sharing NVC, in doing all her work. And also we want to get you some information about 2 workshops we are organizing in Poland with Kathleen. One is about so-called social change and how we can live together in a more serving way. And the other is for trainers, and especially for those who want to go on certification path. Kathleen will be sharing her way of creating community path in certification. So if you want to ask question, you have 2 opportunities to do that. One is to write in a chat window, where Magda will be reading these questions, and the other is to raise your hand. And in the chat window, you have a description. Raise your hand, and when you click it, we see your hand up. So then we know that you want to say something. So this is for a start, and I would like to ask you, Kathleen, what is your favorite way to present yourself, to say about you and who you are in life?
What a question. My favorite way to present myself really is to show up just without even talking and just showing up with my presence. So that might make it hard to do on the Zoom call. But I just want to be seen as another human being who, like the rest of the human beings that I've met, want to make a difference in the world and want their lives to have meaning. And so I've enjoyed doing that in many ways. I have tremendous gratitude for my ancestors who have passed that desire along through the lineage of being there to create community and help make the world a better place. And I've tried to do that in my own life in a wide variety of ways. And one of those ways is, as I've grown up, is to teach in public schools. I used to teach music in the public schools in the state of Washington in the United States. And then I became a music conductor for many, many years, trying to create more harmony in the world through music. And then eventually I learned about nonviolent communication and started to just try to live in that way, live in a way where I really deeply listened to people and expressed and lived more clearly according to what I valued. And that's what I tend to do most of now. So many ways that I imagine myself being, but most of all just as a human being.
Mm-hmm. I hear, but what resonates with me is this creating harmony, creating more harmony through listening. And I also think like this kind of listening can really support people in discovering their own treasures they can bring into the world. Mm. I'm always very touched when you are talking about your work with prisoners in prison, and especially because it seems so beyond my reach also, and seems to be so challenging to be able to be with open heart with people who have done things which can be very triggering for us also. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How it happened that you started working in prisons?
I love the question because I never imagined myself going into prisons. It happened after I was certified as a trainer with the Center for Nonviolent Communication. Lucy Liu was my assessor, and she started the prison program in Washington State. And she just said, "Come on, you're going into prison now." And I said, "Okay." But what happened in those first 3 days, we would have 3-day workshops, is I spent much of the time just absolutely crying because of what I experienced on the inside was actually so much human beauty. So the heart's so deeply opened and wanting to make a difference in the world. And the heartbreak from the harm that they had experienced as children, for most of them, like just deep, deep, deep harm. And then the strategies that they chose to harm themselves or others. I was just caught up in how can this be our response in the world when there's conflict, when there's injury to children, to adults. How can this be our response, that we lock people up inside walls and don't give them the nurturing and don't allow them the chance to contribute all of their gifts? And so for me, I realized that I could just as easily be in their shoes if I had been in their situation. Mm-hmm. And I was really inspired to want to do something different, and at the very least, to show them I cared by just showing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you say, I could be on their place, what it means, what does it really mean for you that you could be there?
What it means is that I can easily empathize with and understand why people made the choices they made to hurt themselves or others, particularly within the systems that they grew up in. What I mean by that is like the patterns of behavior that were all around them, that were in their families and in their schools, where if they weren't able through their own cries of help to get the understanding or the protection that they needed at the time, that they used whatever resources they could. And so I could easily see myself in a situation where I also didn't have access to resources, where I might have had a parent that came home every night and beat myself or somebody else, that I would do whatever I could to stop it. And so that's what I mean, is I started to really understand that if we're not in communities where everybody matters and where everybody has access to protection and everybody has access to food, that sense of mattering, that I could easily choose other strategies to try to take care of those needs in the best I could. Mm. Does that make sense, Martin, answer your question?
Yeah, like seeing what strategies they have available, like we say, NVC, what they have learned in their lives. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what is the systemic approach is to put them more and more outside. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Small crime or whatever they did against the law, it's so easy to be pushed into this direction, to commit more and more severe crimes. Yeah, and it's really difficult to get back, to reconcile. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I remember one woman told me that she and her children kept getting evicted from houses, so they would get removed from houses because they didn't have enough money to pay the rent, and then they would get removed from another house, and they would get removed from another house, and she was terrified that they would end up on the streets without any house. So one day she decided, she had tried to get help from different agencies, and one day she decided that she would rob a bank, because she would either get money and they wouldn't live on the streets, or she would get caught and then they would finally get help. which is what happened. And I feel so sad that those were the choices that she ended up with, because I really want a world where we can look out for one another and make sure everybody has a house, and make sure there's enough food to go around, and make sure that people are protected.
Yeah, like if people have really these basic needs, they have chance to satisfy their very basic needs like home, protection, food. They wouldn't need to turn to such strategies. Yeah. And you are talking that when we are talking about prisons, the word system is coming up. Yeah.
The word system and the word community. Yeah. Yeah.
And this is exactly what we want this 7-day workshop to do about systems and communities. Like, how do you see systems? What does it mean for you that we live in systems?
I'm appreciating you asking the question, because sometimes I just use those words and they mean something to me, but they might mean very different things to other people. So I'm really interested when I talk about things like systems in the practical piece. And for me, what I call a system is just behaviors that repeat themselves. So what are the patterns of behaviors that we as an individual, or we as a family, or we as a society, or those in our spiritual communities, in prison, what are the patterns of behavior that we've developed that then become our cultural norms? And that's all I'm talking about when I use the word system, is how do we behave? And I find that extremely hopeful, because if it's how do I behave, it's something that I can change.
So systems for you isn't something what is outside, what I'm thrown into and what I need to face, but it's something what I do, yeah, consciously or much more often unconsciously, because these are the patterns I developed in my life, yeah?
That's partly true. And the other piece that's really important is that we have developed a lot of patterns of behavior that become cultural norms. So it's how people behave around me. So in the United States, we have certain systems of how money flows back and forth in ways that is not equitable. It's not equal for people. So we have a system set up where some people have money and get more and more and more money, and other people get less and less and less. Or systems where some people can buy houses easily and get the housing they need, and other people don't have access to that or to education. So I'm definitely talking about the patterns of behavior that we as a culture have, or even simply as a family. A system can be very small. It can also be the internal system within myself.
So this is like when behaviors are repeated and they become cultural norms, they like come back to us in a way that we may not really like. Yeah. And so how my change of my patterns or my behaviors can stimulate this change of something that became norm.
I love the question, because I don't have any answers at all, but it's a huge question for me, is where's that, what I would call like an intersection between what's happening on the outside, particularly if it's written down, there are laws that determine our behaviors and our systems and our patterns. And where does that intersect with my individual choices? Because I think the systems that we live in influence our choices, and limit the options that we have. And I also think that my individual choices and resources can be very, very powerful to influence systems. So I'm wanting to look at and explore both of those, and that would be one of the pieces that I really hope that we get to do when we're together in June, is to look at what are the systems or the communities that I want to influence, and what are the pieces that I can do to influence the system, and how have I been influenced by that on the outside.
So this intersection, this mutuality of influence, and also finding my way, to like be in the dialogue. So what I'm passionate about systems is, like, I really want to acknowledge that they have been created or built to serve some needs. Yeah, like we really start from the place we are in, and to do it is to create awareness. What are these default systems, or what are invisible patterns which are holding us, that sometimes we feel like imprisoned by them? Yeah, how do you relate to that?
I love the way you're saying it, and particularly that our default system, it's in other words, what we already know, and so we continue doing it. But to make it really practical for me, I think that when I'm in a community, I can have a conversation about, like, what do we do when conflict comes up? Like, how are we dealing with that right now? Is it working really well for us? There's probably a lot of things that are working really well for us. There's a lot of needs that are being met. And is there anything that's happening that we're doing that is not really working as well as we want it to? Something that we might want to change? And when we start having those conversations, we not only get really clear about what needs we're meeting by what behaviors, but we also make them visible so that we have a lot of choice. That in this moment, it's not working as well as we want. It used to work well maybe, but now it's not. And so let's change it a little bit so it works better for us. There's something about our patterns of behavior that I like to think of as living and changing, that they need to change according to the context and the situation. And that gives me a lot of hope and also excitement. I find it a really creative process.
Yeah, and I had this thought also about this certification process, because it's also one part of path, like within our NVC community, has been created to support people in their development of integration of NVC. And then we see that although we want to change this power over patterns, that there are people who can decide about others, are they ready or not, that we had this intention, and now it turns out that we like reproduce this power over structures, even if we have a different intention. And I'm very fascinated also by your community certification path. And that's why we doing this 3-day workshop, that you can share your discoveries about it. So how do you see this system work reflected in your community certification path?
I wish I can say it works great and we never have any problems. But a little bit of the history is when I was in conversation for about 1.5 years with Marshall and a team of people when they were just trying to figure out, should we start certification again? And they were asking if I'd be willing to be an assessor. And I kept saying, no, it just doesn't make sense to me. And so there's one conversation that changed that. And it was when I asked Marshall, I said, Marshall, why would you look to me? Like, I'm guessing there's something about the way that I live NVC that's kind of aligned with how you envision it. He says, yeah. And I said, I will never be able to assess or evaluate somebody else's consciousness. But what I can do is I can have a relationship with them, and I can walk side by side with them so that I can get that sense with another person if we share a common understanding of NVC, both in how we think about it, but also how we live it out and how we share it or talk about it. I said, if you want me to walk side by side until there's a mutual understanding, I can do that. Is that what you want? And he said, yes. And so that for me is the path towards certification, is this walking side by side. And it can look like one person with one person. But for me, my own opinion of that mutual agreement wasn't enough at all. And so we started with a community of people who wanted to walk on the certification path, and very quickly decided, how do we want to learn together? How do we want to learn from each other? How do we as a community want to get that sense of a shared path and shared vision? And so we started building ways to learn together. So we have a learning system, and we started asking, how do we resolve conflict when it comes up in a way that gives us a sense that we're in this together in the shared paradigm? And how do we want to make decisions together about what we do? And how do we want to give each other feedback so we can learn and grow? So over the course of 10 years, we've really started to, it's been a very, very messy process. But we've started to figure out, how do we want to behave with each other so that we can learn together and grow together and give each other feedback. And so it's been a great journey. And when someone in our community becomes certified, it's because a community of 20 or 30 people feel comfortable with them taking on that title because they see it lived and there's a shared understanding. And so that feels to me like so much relief, rather than just me saying it's a shared understanding, but having 25 other people saying, what do you mean? I don't see that at all.
So it's also gives you support in your role as an assessor, when you have the community of shared understanding and seeing this person from many different perspectives and in many different situations.
Yes, because I need to learn and grow every day too. So I'm constantly learning from people as we explore, what is this thing that we call NVC? We're learning together. It's mutual learning.
Yeah. What is this thing we call NVC?
What is it?
I remember when you were saying about your meeting with Marshall in Switzerland, I think it was, when you came there and he said, oh, there is no such thing as NVC.
Yeah. Yeah, that was tough because I'd left 2 young children at home in the United States to go there. And it was very hard. And then he said, there's no such thing as NVC. It's like, why did I come here?
So how do you really understand this sentence?
Well,
because
fortunately,
it meant something with this. Yeah.
It did. Fortunately, he followed that sentence with, but if there was something called NVC, it would include 5 different elements. It would include a certain consciousness that we're so clear that we live interconnected and interbeing, interdependently on this planet. And it's so clear that that power is to be shared in a way that's power with. And we also, it's so clear that there's a kind of natural giving that happens when we give because it's joyful to give and not out of obligation. And so if that's the consciousness we want to develop, then I also want to look at the language that I use so that my language really supports that consciousness. And I want to look at the way I'm thinking, because my thinking is my worldview, and I want my worldview to line up with the consciousness. And I want to look at how I use power in the world. so that we can develop and cultivate power with. So he said, as soon as we call it a thing, it becomes stagnant. It becomes something that it's not. It's a worldview. It's a spirituality. It's a framework to support us being connected to life. So don't call it a thing. Just live it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, it's also triggering when people use the word model. It's the NVC model.
Yeah.
We really want to escape from this labeling and generalization, and then we follow again into it, like we fall into the same traps and again and again and again.
Yes. And for me, the model or the form is an important part of the learning. And so I'm so grateful to Marshall for the form, because it's helped me get back to the consciousness regularly. But if I stop with the form, it then becomes something that feels very disconnecting, rather than just a pathway to be connected to my own values, so that the form can become very fluid and very natural.
Yeah.
Is that your experience too?
Yeah,
Martha?
like the form is when it's lived in, yeah, it becomes alive. When it's like petrifies me, like I have to do this particular thing in communication, then it's again, I'm losing life.
Yeah.
Okay, I wonder if there are any questions from people who are together with us here. Magda?
There are no questions in the chat.
So
I don't see any raised hands.
So maybe I really turn to you, our spectators or participants, to take the chance to ask a question or about something specific, what Kathleen is doing, or about the workshops we are planning to be in June in Poland.
And I would be particularly interested in, what is your interest? What are the communities that you would like to influence, that you would like to have something happen that would make life more wonderful?
Yeah. And during like this time, when you think about your questions or anything you want to share, maybe from your experience while working with, let's call, systems, I have a kind of anxiety about sharing NVC with people who work in workplaces which are full of violence. Like they experience this different kind of relatedness. They experience what is possible between people and how we can create communities, how can we work together in a different way. And then people come back to their workplaces and they were resilient to some way, and now they are open. They have open hearts. They really want to bring change, and something is happening, like recreation of trauma, because they cannot get through these petrified systems, or the ways of behavior that really are hurting. So do you have the way to support people in being safe when they're coming back to the places where violence is like on daily basis, language, in relatedness, on many different levels?
If I'm understanding your question, it's really how to provide support as people are making change. Like, how do they get the support they need for the consequences that they might experience? Is that part of it?
Yeah.
yeah, I love the question, and for me, it's one of the at the very heart of like nonviolence is how do I make sure that my humanity and another person's humanity doesn't get lost, and then how do I live from that place where you called an open heart, so that it doesn't shut down. And I don't have answers for that. Other than community is my best resource for me personally, is to be able to go back over and over and over to the people that I love and the people that know me, to remind me of how I want to live and the choices that I want to make to bring our humanity and make it more visible in the world. Because from my work in prison and other places, I think systems that dehumanize people are the only systems where violence can happen. And so any amount of humanity I can bring into a system will make it a thriving system. And I see that as my work in nonviolence is to be willing to keep myself human and keep other people's humanity visible, even in the midst of violence. And I ask myself that question every day: am I willing to step into that and absorb the impact? I don't know. I wish I could say yes every day. I wish I could do it, and it's part of my practice to continue to try to say yes and find the support to say yes.
Yeah. So I hear how much community, this NVC community of shared understanding of what humanity is and what is possible, how we can live together when we see each other beyond our roles, beyond our obligations and have-tos. So that it gives you a lot of strength to try again, and to see the human being in every single person, whatever strategies this person is applying into the life.
Marta, we have a question.
Yeah, great.
Wait, Ivona, Marta, you are unmuted now.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to ask a question. What kind of communities, is there any specific community or kinds of that you would like to work around in a workshop? And I'm asking because due to my health condition, I am dealing with the healthcare system at the moment with doctors and other patients. And actually it's not a community, and this is a huge problem. So is there a possibility to discuss, I think, how to create a community? To change a system to become a bit more communal instead of being very much hierarchical and separated, like nurses are powered over by the doctors and patients are powered over by everyone, and how to make a community.
Well, I love the question. I feel a lot of tenderness hearing that you're in that situation, not just because you're working there, but because there's you need that system for that support too. Yeah. And so it's an extra hard, I think, place to be in when you're also trying to get the support and work in the system at the same time.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a couple places. One is sometimes when I hear a question like that, I can feel overwhelmed. It's like so big. And there's this other place inside that I just want to remember, like what's the one step I can do to move closer to the kind of world that I want. So I love that you specifically ask, how do we start creating communities within those systems? I love that way of thinking. Who are the two people right now that I can connect with and we can have some understanding about this, and how can we invite two others into it, and how can I change my relationship with this one nurse or with this one doctor? It's so beautiful. Mm-hmm.
It is something that I can do it for myself. I create good relationships with doctors and with nurses, but I see that I use my skills. I know a bit about NVC. I have some soft skills because I'm basically an HR consultant. So I really have resources. But it's painful for me that other people who don't have that kind of resources don't have it. And I'd love to be able to be helpful to them, like to make it a little bit more of a community. So it's not that we are everyone on our own. If I have my own resources, I will get better relationship. But if somebody else doesn't, then he or she it will be harder for them. So is there any way to create kind of a community? To create this little, even incremental change.
And if I'm understanding your question, how do we really change the system so that all of those who participate in the system, not just one person, can get the benefits of that?
Yeah.
Correct?
Thank you.
Yeah. And that for me is like a lifelong question. And part of the exploration that I'm doing is to how can we make the parts of the system really visible, the parts that are working and that are meeting needs. So it's not just they're visible to me and my doctor, but it's also within the whole doctor's office and within the people that they work with, so that the parts of the system and the patterns of behavior that are really working, we can all kind of agree and notice that they're working so that we can repeat them.
Yeah.
And to do the same process with the parts that really aren't working and come up with alternatives that could change that. That's part of the big reason, part of something I think is important in changing systems is to not just have what we don't like, but also what we could do that could really benefit perhaps other people, all of the people who are partaking in the system. And there's something, there's a lot of different theories of change, but I find it interesting how I can never know if something that seems really small will suddenly make a big shift, or if it'll always be this little small thing that doesn't seem to matter much except a one-time situation. Like that's part of the mystery for me is I don't know, but I'd love to learn with many others who are doing this work is how do we make it longer lasting and deeper roots? Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Great.
Yeah, so what I really like is about really acknowledging and naming what works for us. Whatever we experience, that we start with this with gratitude, with seeing these parts which are working, and also that we can recognize ourselves as parts which bring something, which are valuable parts. Yeah. And then to discover the leverage. Do you have in your experience in prison or in other work you are doing that you found this kind of leverage that created bigger change?
Yeah, I was just trying to think of some examples during Ivona's question. I can think of more particular moments when something shifted in the room and we all chose to go in a different direction, such as, I think I told this story earlier today when I was in the women's prison and I was looking for a roll of tape that I had brought in, and apparently one woman had stolen it. And as soon as I started looking, the whole room just froze because they knew it was stolen. And their thought was that I was then going to tell an officer, and they were all going to get severely punished. for it, and they were so angry. And so it took about 2 hours of empathy and also speaking honestly to really convince them that we could change how the next part of the story goes. We could continue the story that you understand. I could go tell an officer and you could all get searched. But we could also choose something different that I think will work much better for all of us. And so we worked and worked and worked to try to come up with a different solution that we finally found that kept everybody safe, including the woman who took the tape. And so there's something about those moments when we have this way of, it doesn't have to be the way it's always done. We could do something different in a way that works for us. That I believe that there's an ongoing relationship we can change. One intentional community I was a part of, we spent months looking at how do we want to make decisions together so that everyone has a voice and that everyone, the ideas that are coming up from individuals get heard and get seen, and the creativity within our community can be heard. And so we created a pathway and then had to practice that pathway so it became more of a natural way of doing things and then became more foundational in what we did.
Yeah, with this example with the tape, it's like bringing awareness that this pathway, this behavior we are repeating, it's not the only one. We can find different. And for me, it's really the matter of trust. Yeah, that they can be safe with you, that you create this safe space that they can be honest and really explore. And for me, this is like changing the dynamics, that there are other people I can really trust, that they really want to create the change in our patterns here. And I understand that from this point, the work with those women was different because you were able to really stay with them and create this kind of space where they can experience a different solution.
And part of that shift for me is purpose. When we got really clear about why we were in the room together, then we could choose behaviors that would address that. And so I wasn't in the room to control their behavior, but we were in the room because we wanted to know what to do with our anger, because we wanted to know what to do with conflict. And so we actually got to practice. And I find that in communities, I'm not always around people that I necessarily trust. I haven't built that trust with them yet. But when communities become really clear about why I'm there, like what purpose, what are we doing together? Then we somehow lean into that possibility of trust and also like actions, on the ground actions that help build trust, which is part of that changing the behaviors. So I do think they go hand in hand. Yeah.
Like the purpose-driven communities can see what is the best for them to achieve this purpose. Yeah. Yeah. And in the other example you were saying, it's about creating this decision-making system. Are you willing to say more about it? Did you use like specific methods you applied, or you just were basing on different ideas and created your own one?
Yes and yes. I'm laughing because it would be so simple just to take another methodology that's already out there. There are so many.
Yeah.
But we took a little bit of sociocracy and we took a little bit of holacracy, and we kind of created our own. We wanted it to be simple and usable. And then we had that for a few years. And then because systems are living and changing and we always want to review them, then we reviewed them 1 year and then made it all more complicated again to cover more varieties. So it depends on the year. It's not as simple anymore, but it's clearer about the different kinds of decisions that we would make.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, you can look at our decision if you go to livinginterdependence.org.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if somebody wants to write that in the chat. It's an example of our, it's the website for our candidate community. So there are examples of different systems. And most importantly is at livinginterdependence.org. There's, it says links on the first page, and underneath it, there's the recognized role we've set up guide. It's a long title, but that's about the New Future process. The recognized role we've set up guide is kind of a handbook for going through and setting up systems in any community. And there's a lot of links to other methodologies and other resources to use. So I'm excited about that document.
Mm.
And I think of communities, I think this is one other question, Ivana, that you talked about, is I think of a community as any place where I'm impacted by the well-being of others, or others impact my well-being. So a community can just be my small family. It could be my group of friends. It can be the United States government right now. Like, those are all communities that impact my well-being.
Mm.
And so really making a choice about which community and how do I want to, I might use different methods of influence depending on the community that I'm in.
Mm. So how do you see yourself being in a community in government of United States at the moment?
I wish I knew.
Mm.
I really am trying to find ways. Because when I first met Marshall, he talked about always working on 3 levels at one time, working on yourself, and then working on the relationships between you and other people, and also working on the level of systems. He says, don't just work on yourself, and then when you've got that figured out, go on to the next one. He says, we don't have time. So work on all 3 levels at the same time. So I always try to do something myself, and then something kind of regional, and then something more national. And so the pieces that are the bigger systemic pieces for me is certainly my prison work. There have been prisons all over the United States and in other places of the world that have just been inspired by what's happened in Washington State that Lucy Liu started. And a lot of programs have grown from there, and including some in Poland is my understanding. And then like in Oklahoma, I'll be in there doing a 5-day training in Oklahoma prison that is looking at moving that work across the whole state. And so there's, again, it starts from a very small, spending a weekend with 30 men in the room or 30 women in the room, to the idea that starts to catch on and it being spread in a wider way. So certainly prison work is some of the more bigger systemic work I've been doing. And also the other piece is that just that experiment with my certified candidate community, just how do we want to live together, and let's learn about systems, and how do we want to resolve conflicts. I'm now finding communities all around the world that are asking for very similar experiences of how do we want to build community. I was just in Mexico 2 weeks ago with that question is how do we want to create the certification process so it arises from our community, from the beauty and the strength that's already here in a way that is not colonizing Mexico again, but we're actually bringing in the principles of NVC with the beauty of our own culture.
Mm.
And I feel excited about those conversations.
Mm-hmm. So I see that you have this approach that people working together find their ways which serves them best. Yeah, whatever system we want to create, it's creating between us. It's our behavior we want to repeat. Yeah, and at the same time. So how to put it in words, it's something about, we have so much resources in NVC community and ways and knowledge. And then I have this idea that we really get into the same traps again and again and again. Like having this awareness, there's still so much unresolved situation even in between CNVC certified trainers. Yeah, and there is so much pain, and I hear one person like consciously stop being certified. Like, can you see the ways how we can really embody these principles, like really create something that would work for us? Yeah, it's so much pain about it.
Yeah, I join you, like just noticing the sadness that comes up to be part of an organization who does magical work in the world and so much, and also I don't see CNVC having their system set up to know what to do to move through conflict or how to give feedback to one another. So we use very, very limited and traditional ways of attempting that. So I think it's one of my hopes and dreams, and I was very involved for about 3 years on the change of the organization, using Frederick Ballou's work as a base and NVC principles to try to create some of those systems and get clear about how we organize ourselves and how we make decisions, how we move through conflict. And that is paused in some way. But what I'm discovering is that people actually around the world are just starting their own communities and living that way, making their own choices. So it's had a lot of influence, I think, because
even if it hasn't been finished, it was stopped at one point, and at the same time, these ideas which were in this document, are spreading around.
So even if like the board of directors or the people who have the leadership or structural powers or the assessors in the organization aren't taking on those ideas or methodologies, so much of the rest of the network is. And so we're changing and growing more community-based. And I think the more of us in our individual communities have structures to move through conflict and structures to learn from one another, structures to get empathy from one another, to support one another, that those become the defaults and the norm that will then help spread that globally.
So to start with small communities we creating around us, and then when we have these patterns and behaviors like embodied within our small communities, then it can grow to be like more global. But it, like I see this process going from down up. And I imagine this kind of workshop we want to organize in Poland. It will be really about how can we create it and how can we, and maybe not duplicate, but inspire each other with our solutions.
Yes. Yeah. How do you want to live together, and how can I support that? I'm no expert on community, And I love to facilitate communities talking amongst themselves about what their biggest dreams are and how to move toward that. Yeah.
So isn't it, when we start with the dreams, isn't the danger that we really forget where we are in the moment? How do you see those two perspectives or embrace those two perspectives at the same time? Being here and now with what's around us and holding on to our dreams.
I love the question. I don't know if I've ever heard it before. Yeah, I think I would, I'd be so curious about how different your dream is from what you're actually living. And part of it for me is, what are you actually doing right now? And what are you hoping for? And then, is there a gap? And if so, what's the bridge that crosses that gap?
Yeah.
Maybe there's not a gap, but it just wasn't visible to us before. So how do we just make it visible?
And I didn't get it. What was invisible?
Maybe just what you were doing. Sometimes I find in communities that we're already doing these things, but we aren't aware of it. It's not visible.
We haven't named it.
Yes, thank you. You haven't named it. And once it gets named, then it's easy, as more people come into the community, to say, oh, this is how we do things here. How would that work for you? Or to remind people, like in the midst of conflict, remember there's 10 different processes we can choose from right now. Which one sounds like the best one for this situation?
So then the naming the resources, seeing the resources and cherishing them, this is the way how we can make the best use of them. Yeah.
Perhaps we've found it useful in our community to do that, particularly when things get tense. It's hard to remember all the resources that are there. So it helps us.
Like to stop and reconnect.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so grateful for all the work, like the familiar faces that are on the screen, that the hearts that I've already fallen in love with, and all the work that it's already been to have me visit your beautiful country before, and then all the work that's going into it for a second time. I just want you to know how much I cherish those relationships and cherish the work that you're doing. And if I can support that in any way, I'm happy to.
Okay. I have one thought in mind. I heard from one NVC trainer, and he said, like, one of the most painful jackals or invisible jackals, which is biting us, is what to do. Yeah, and that the real question is how we are together, how we are, like to change this perspective, how we relate to each other. And maybe this is one of the ways to create different systems, like they create themselves by changing our relatedness.
Yes, and in a very practical way, very practical day-to-day doing and being with each other. Yeah, thank you, Marta. I like that way of framing it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm also realizing how much gratitude you're expressing, and you expressed throughout this hour. And this is also one of the answers I'm taking with myself, like to really be connected to this gratitude part. Yeah. I wonder if there is anything that you want to say as a goodbye, like anyone from community, from those people who are here. Something happened. We are all muted. Yeah. Kathleen is muted.
I think there were 2 lines unmuted at the same time. If we could try one.
Mm-hmm.
Asha and Ivona, if we could try one at a time, that might work.
It was I think it's on Joanna's line is something. Yeah. So maybe I invite you to write something in chat window as goodbye for Kathleen, and I'm so grateful that Kathleen, you took your time and we could hear your reflection and you could share your work with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it and appreciate the time that all of you have spent with us.
So we are finishing for today, and we planned another webinar in February, which will be more deep, in depth to our social change workshop in June. Thank you so much. Okay, we're finishing now. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.